the book of Proverbs. And we live in an information age. It is an age of computers, and many people are pretty good. They're pretty good with their computers or with technology, but as smart as they may be in that area, they are amateurs when it comes to making success of their lives. And we see talented people in all sorts of different fields. They may be great athletes that don't know how to live their life. They may be incredible actors or and don't know how to live their lives. They may be artists, they may be auto mechanics, and they have incredible skill, and yet they do not know how to live their lives. And so people may know how an engine runs, or how to read an offense, or how to paint a beautiful painting. They know how to use their gifts and their talents, but they don't have the ability to use that knowledge wisely. And so what we need today, I think, and we probably needed for a long time, is we need wisdom. And so the book of Proverbs is about wisdom. It's about godly wisdom. And it's about how do we get it and how do we use it. It's about priorities. It's about principles. Proverbs doesn't really give us those kind of get-rich-quick schemes or success formulas. It tells you not how to make a living, but how to be skillful in the lost art of making a life. So it doesn't tell us how to make a living, but how to live. And so that's where we're going to address for the next, I don't know, we're going to be here for a while. So tonight what I want to do is I just want to introduce the book of Proverbs and consider some of its challenges, some of the things we can be looking for, how it's structured, maybe some proper ways, some hints as to how we interpret the Proverbs, because we're going to look at them a little bit differently than other types of literature in the Bible. So I guess we should probably begin with the question, what is a proverb? And let me just address, at least from the biblical standpoint, a proverb comes from the Hebrew word mashal, and it just simply means to be like. It's a comparison. It is noting a likeness, or it's noting a likeness in things that aren't alike. So it's just comparing. It literally means to be like something. And so every culture has proverbs. That's certainly not unique to the Hebrews. Every culture has its own unique set of collected wisdom, pithy insights from the wise. So can you think of any proverbs that we have in our culture?
A stitch in time saves 9.
Okay.
So what exactly does that one mean?
Right.
It means if you make a stitch in a piece of clothing early enough, you won't have to make 9 of them when it tears farther down the seam.
Oh, wow. I never knew what that meant. I've heard that.
Awesome. What else?
I've heard God helps those who help themselves.
Okay. That would be a proverb.
About an apple a day keeps the
all right. An apple a day keeps the doctor away.
I just think of like Chinese fortune cookies. I can't
Okay.
think of it. But you know, like they always have things in there.
Yep. Chinese fortune cookies, yeah. A penny saved is a penny earned. So every culture has a lot of proverbs. And really, in general, you might say that a proverb is just simply a brief, pithy, concrete statement that illustrates general truths. All right? So we've defined a few others. Anybody else want to throw out a proverb that we?
Waste not, want not.
Waste not, want not. Okay, awesome. Those are great. Those would all be proverbs. So, like I said, every culture has a collected set of proverbial sayings. And so the Hebrews were not unique in that. And so, in one sense, then the book of Proverbs is not unique because every culture has them. However, biblical proverbs are unique in another sense, and they're unique because they are grounded in the covenant relationship with God Almighty. In fact, and we'll study this tonight, we learn that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So Solomon is not just merely offering up clever sayings that provide useful advice on how to enjoy worldly success. Rather, he teaches that true wisdom and success are rooted in having a right relationship with God, who is the source of all wisdom. So biblical proverbs are unique in the sense that they are grounded in the creator of the universe. They're also unique in the sense that they are part of inspired scripture. So these are, this is part of God's word, not just a wise saying, like a stitch in time saves nine, or a penny saved, or a penny is a penny earned. Those are great statements, but they are not part of inspired scripture. So in the book of Proverbs, we have God's word made known to us, and these particular proverbs are grounded in knowing the creator of the universe. As we mentioned, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And so this is where everything starts. Another really interesting aspect, or maybe one of the uniqueness of biblical proverbs, is how practical the proverbs are. So a lot of people would say, well, I don't understand the Bible. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's not practical. Well, the book of Proverbs, they can't read that and say, well, that doesn't apply there. It's like it's intensely practical. And so in the Proverbs, we learn how to live in God's world. This is God's world. And so there are some general principles of how to live in such a way that you might have success, and ways in which if you live, you may not have success. So they're very, very practical. How do we live in God's world? That's what Proverbs help us to understand. And so we gain understanding. There's a lot of topics that we're going to cover in the book of Proverbs, and we gain information about a lot of them. So we're going to learn about work and marriage and religion and sex and children and education and morals and integrity, and all of these elements of life are dealt with in the book of Proverbs. And not only that, but it speaks to pretty much every type of person, young and old, and skilled and unskilled, regardless of male and female. So there is this scope there. The scope of the Proverbs reaches to everybody. So any thoughts on that little bit of introduction at this point? All right, then I'm going to need, we're going to, as we go along, I'm going to ask maybe, or have you all volunteer, if you will, just to read a few Proverbs as we go through them. This is going to help us. Yes, Simone?
What is the blank?
Oh, that means
Intensely.
practical.
That's what I put in there. I'm glad.
Yep. So fill in the blank. Practical. So, all right. So let's talk about some of the challenges of Proverbs, because they do present some. So if I can get somebody to to look up Proverbs 22:6. And I need somebody to look up 28:13 and then 26:4 and 5. So when somebody gets 22:6, shout, say, I got it.
I got it.
All right. Does somebody have 28:13?
I got it.
I got 26.
We got 26. Who has 26?
I got 26.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so Scott, Davidson household, read Proverbs 22:6.
Okay, 22:6. Train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it.
Okay, Chase, read 28:13.
Whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy.
Okay, so right off the bat, you can see one of the challenges that we have with Proverbs. Proverbs are not promises, all right? They are not laws. They are not commandments. Rather, they are general truths. So oftentimes you'll hear people say, well, you train up a child in the way he shall go, and he will not depart from his ways, as though everybody who trains up their child in the way that they should go, they always remain godly people. Well, there's a lot of people who have trained their children a godly way, and their children have wandered off. And so that's just the way it is. And so we can't treat Proverbs as though they are promises that I can just go through them and say that these are absolute promises of God that are inviolable, invariable, and it's just the way it is. Likewise, the Proverbs 28:13 says, whoever conceals his transgression will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. Well, we know a lot of wicked people who prosper. All right? So again, these are not promises, but they are general truths. Generally, if you train up your children well, in general, they're going to do well. Sandy?
I thought that meant confessing to God when I read it.
Uh-huh,
I
so-
thought that's what it meant.
Right, but he who confesses and forsakes them, what his transgressions will receive mercy. All right, so
I didn't think of it as just individual people doing whatever they want. I thought of that as
right, so
they're telling you if you transgress and you tell God you did and he forgives you.
okay, so the first part of it says, whoever conceals his transgression will not prosper. And yet we know people who
Right.
prosper, who conceal their transgressions. Notice the word but he who confesses. And so lots of Proverbs are, sorry to use this word, they're antithetical. In other words, you're going to see a but. So the two lines contrast one another. So the first line states one thing, and the second line states the opposite.
Okay.
All right, and we're going to see that over and over and over again. And so I did not include a section this evening on Hebrew poetry, but this is Hebrew poetry. And one of the features of Hebrew poetry is this idea of parallel lines. And so in Proverbs, you're going to get a lot of these parallel lines, and sometimes they're contrary. The first line and the second line are contrary to one another. Sometimes they say the same thing. The second line repeats the first line. But anyways, thanks for bringing that up, because that will help us. So as we go along, we might talk about various types of Hebrew poetry, but I just wasn't sure if that's something that I'm the only one who's interested in and everybody else yawns at. But
No, actually, it is kind of interesting. There's a whole bunch of different ones, like the contrasting, the parallel, and then there's like the weird acrostic thing that they do in some of them.
All right, so there's weird acrostic, and as we'll get into it, Proverbs actually has, there are numeric proverbs, but we usually see in Hebrew poetry, we see three different types, and we see the synonymous parallels, which you said where the second line repeats the first. They say the same thing, just in a different way. The second line just restates the first line. So we'll get into to some of those. Then there's the antithetical, which we just talked about, and you can pick those out easily because the second line begins with the word but. All right, and they're all over the place. And then there is another kind of just repeat, that just kind of extends the thought. And then, Scott, you brought up this idea of acrostics, and that's these are memory devices that each line begins with the same letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And then we'll get into actually numeric proverbs, but I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So there's all sorts of different, Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme. Because I don't know what rhymes with hatabar, so that's just the way it is. But, all right, so let's look at, so remember, one of the challenges of Proverbs is to remember that these are not necessarily promises, they're general truths. In general, these things are true. All right. So then here's another problem that we're going to come up against, and that is contradictory or conflicting statements. And Chase, read Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. This is a famous one.
Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes.
Okay, so it is answer not a fool. Then the other one is answer a fool. All right, so people are saying, well, obviously, when this was written, the author wasn't an idiot. He knew these two things conflict with one another. So why do you think he would put those two conflicting proverbs one right after the other? Is there a reason? Was he just...
I'm sure there was a reason.
Don't answer this way, answer this way.
Right, but then he turns around and says the opposite.
No, but I'm saying, that's what he's saying. He's saying, don't answer this way, answer this way.
Okay,
That's what I meant to say.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So answer
So
not a
it's
fool.
instructive.
Yeah, right. Lest you be like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise. So the one says, don't talk to a fool, you better just be quiet. The other is, say something to him.
In other words, do you want to guide him
Okay.
by telling him what he's doing wrong or saying wrong?
Yeah, but the previous one said, just keep your mouth shut. You know, it's goofy to say anything to him. So, anybody else got a thought why those two things are opposing one another? My thoughts, and I'd be happy to hear your others, is I think they're purposely set there, and the goal is, again, it compels the reader to ponder a little bit more seriously on the issue about how do I respond to a fool. It's not, again, it's not a promise, it's not a law, it's not a commandment. It's not like God saying, answer a fool, and then he turns around the next, don't say anything to a fool. It's causing the reader to think about how do I respond to a fool? Perhaps there are times when I just need to keep my mouth shut because it's just, why cast my pearls before swine? This is just a foolish endeavor. Other times, I'm going to say something, so that he does not think he is wise in his own estimation. So again, very general maxims. They help us in life. and sometimes they're written to make us think a little bit.
And,
Right?
and possibly they are in order. I'm trying to remember, but you start out by just ignoring him.
Okay.
If that doesn't work, then you really may, and if he continues to spout foolishness, then maybe you need to talk to him.
Okay, awesome. I think there's some legitimacy to that answer. So yeah. So Proverbs are, like I said, that they're not necessarily promises, but they are general guides to life, how to live in the world that God has made. So there are some challenges. So when we get to Proverbs, we're going to have some various challenges that how do we interpret these? So you have to remember, again, this is not only is this Hebrew poetry, but it's what falls into a category called wisdom literature. And the Hebrews and other cultures had wisdom literature. And does anybody know what are the 3 primary books of wisdom literature in the Old Testament? There are 3 biggies. There's probably some others that kind of are close, but 3 books that would be considered wisdom literature. Proverbs is one, so I'm taking off the table.
Ecclesiastes.
Is it Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon?
Probably not Song of Solomon.
Job.
So,
I was thinking
Lamentation.
Ecclesiastes.
Job and nope, those would not be. I think we would end up with Ecclesiastes, Job, and Proverbs. The others are poetic. I'm not saying they're not books of poetry. Song of Solomon is definitely a poetic book, and Lamentations would be a poetic book. But these are generally fall into the category of wisdom literature, and just some background information. So the next question then is, who wrote it? Does anybody tell me who wrote the book of Proverbs?
Multiple authors.
Multiple authors. I have one. Who name one of the authors?
Solomon.
Solomon. Okay, so chapter 1, verse 1, chapter 10, verse 1, and chapter 25, verse 1, it tells us that Solomon wrote many of the Proverbs. And so, don't you think that's ironic?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, really. So, on the one hand, in Scripture, who's the wisest man who ever lived?
Solomon.
Solomon. But man, was his life a mess or what? Did he just totally... Do you remember how Solomon gained his wisdom? Do you remember that event that God said, I'm going to make you wise?
Wasn't he offered, riches and
Right.
everything, and he chose wisdom?
Yeah, so Solomon comes to the throne. His father David has died. Solomon comes to the throne, and God tells him, ask whatever you want. I'll give you kingdoms and power and riches and whatever you want. And Solomon very great, humbly says, who am I to have this? What I need is wisdom. All right? And so God gives him wisdom. All right? And yet, the very first thing Solomon does is he goes and marries a foreign woman, all right, which is just the last thing that he was. And then he builds a house and a temple for his Egyptian wife so she can worship her God. And all of a sudden, Solomon is in a heap of trouble. So it's kind of ironic that Solomon, this wise individual who wrote the bulk of the book of Proverbs, was maybe at the same time the wisest man in the world and the most foolish man in the world.
It seems
I'm sorry, Samuel?
it just seems like his wisdom drove him to madness at times.
Yeah, I think that could be. I think another thing, that's a good point. I think another thing is, he failed in his strength. A lot of times, we're strong in an area and, we can fail in the areas that we're strong with. You know, I don't know, maybe the doctor who doesn't take care of himself, that type of thing. You know, the bike shop owner whose bike is always broken, you know, something like that. You know.
Or wisdom became an idol, and instead of worshiping God, wisdom took over. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's good. Sometimes knowing the right thing to do just isn't enough. And so we need to be wary of the inherent temptations that come with our strengths. So sometimes we're strong in an area, but that doesn't mean we're impervious to temptation in those areas either. And so we get looking at our weaknesses and defending those areas, but sometimes our very strengths can be our downfall. So, so keep those things in mind. So Solomon wrote a lot of the Proverbs, and he was considered a wise man. The Queen of Sheba came to see his wisdom and was in awe of his wisdom. And yet, in many ways, he was just a great fool. All right, somebody look up chapter 31:1. I'm sorry, 31:1, and then somebody else look up 31. Chapter 30, verse 1. And whoever gets to chapter 30, verse 1, shout it out.
Got it.
All right.
The words of Agur, the
Okay.
son of Jakeh, the oracle, the man declares to Ithiel and Ukal.
Okay. So the words of Agur. All right. So we have another person by the name of Agur, who is one of the authors, or at least of chapter 30 of that series of Proverbs, this individual. And then who's got 31:1?
The words of King Lemuel, the utterance which his mother taught him.
Okay, so the words of King Lemuel. So we actually have at least 3 different contributors to the book of Proverbs. Some would include a general council of wise men. I'm not convinced by that, but 3 very designated people. Mostly Solomon, but a chapter from Agur and a chapter from Lemuel.
And I kind of think, well, when I was reading this historical context Bible that I'm reading this year, there were some indications that some of these Proverbs are very similar to ones that came out of Egypt and other areas around there, and so they're not sure which way the taking of Proverbs went, whether it went from Israel to them or what.
Good point. Good point. So yeah, some of them, it's common knowledge. So
I like how in chapter 31, this was an oracle that his mother taught him.
okay, yeah, we're going to get to that. So
You know.
yeah, so Simone brought up how chapter 31 is the wisdom that his mother taught him, and I'm going to, as we get towards the end of this, I think that's that becomes kind of important as we try to figure out how the book of Proverbs is structured. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of Proverbs. And when we look at, I think we can see maybe 5 major sections. We see an introduction, and I hope to study that tonight. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 7 is pretty much just an introduction to the book. And then from 1:8 all the way up into chapter 10, we find this rather large section. It's this exhortation to choose wisdom. And 2 women are highlighted in that section. Does anybody know who those 2 women are? They're personifications of they're not two actual women, but they are two attributes that are personified.
Oh, it's the harlot, I think.
Okay, right. So we have the woman of the Lady Folly,
Yeah.
foolish.
Wisdom.
Okay, and then wisdom. So we have these two women being personified. Wisdom is personified. To follow wisdom leads to life. To follow folly, though tantalizing, leads to death. Both wisdom and folly are personified as wisdom, and so there's a series of messages by Lady Wisdom to follow her ways and to flee the adulteress, to flee men who oppress, to flee men who extort, flee from those things. And so Lady Folly is trying to get this young man to follow her and the adulteress and men who oppress and extort, whereas Lady Wisdom is saying, no, buy from me wisdom and you will live. And so that's the first big section in the book of Proverbs, this exhortation to choose wisdom. The next major area is chapter 10, verse 1 through 29, 27. And this is really where the, quote, classic Proverbs begin. These are individual couplets. And what I mean by couplets is just two lines. They seem to be pretty haphazard. There's no rarely a discernible theme. So if you go to Proverbs chapter 10 and just start reading it, you'll just see it just seems like there's no rhyme or reason for the most part. So we see a lot of righteous and unrighteousness, but there's no real central theme to them. But those are kind of the classic Proverbs. When we speak of Proverbs, that's usually what we're talking about. And then finally, we get into the sayings of Augur in chapter 30, and these are numerical, often numerical in their content. And what I mean by that is, for instance, chapter 30, verse 15 says, the leech has two daughters, give and give. Three things are never satisfied, four never say enough. So the leech has two daughters, three things are never satisfied, four never say enough. Verse 18, three things are too wonderful for me, four I do not understand. 21, under three things the earth trembles, under four it cannot bear up. 24, four things on the earth are small, but they are exceedingly wise. Verse 29, three things are steady in their tread, four are stately in their stride. And so we might just call those numeric proverbs. And then finally we get to the words of King Lemuel in chapter 31. And so what is the main topic of chapter 31?
His mother taught him.
Okay, right. So it's the ideal woman, all right? And so when we get there, it's the ideal woman. It's not like, again, ladies, you can take comfort. This is not saying you need to do all of these things, all right? So don't put that pressure on yourself. This is the ideal woman. And and Simone kind of pointed this out, that these are the woman giving instruction to her sons. The book of Proverbs begins with Solomon giving wisdom to his sons, and it closes with the ideal woman giving instruction to her sons. And so we have both mother and father imparting wisdom to their children. So I think that makes really good bookends, if you will. So. So Jesse, I'm not, you asked the question, could Solomon have inserted the words written by others and his mention simply have given them authorship in 30 and 31? I guess maybe I'm not understanding the question, I guess.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, what I was asking was, could he have just inserted the words of others in his writings and just given them credit?
So he could have written 30 and 31 and given Augur and Lemuel credit?
No, yeah, well, he penned it, but he didn't, he wasn't the author. In other words, he had some people that thought, hey, this would be cool, and we're going to go ahead and write this, and Solomon picked up on it and felt it was inspired enough to go ahead and insert it with his writings. Is that something that is conceivable?
Are you talking about chapters 30 and 31? Or are you talking about what Scott was mentioning, how some proverbs may have been borrowed from other cultures? I guess you're probably speaking very clearly, and I'm not getting it.
Okay, let me go to 30 and 31 here. Proverbs 30, verse 1. Okay, here, could Solomon say, and these are the words of Agar, the son of Jakeh, and then Penn wrote down what they were saying. In other words, it's still written by Solomon, but it's what he had heard or had knowledge of what they had said.
Sure, I could see that being, yeah, that makes sense to me. I could see that, but it's still the words of Augur. It's just Solomon wrote them. He's getting
right.
He's not plagiarizing. He's
right.
So
I guess what I'm saying is the people that gathered these writings together in Proverbs, perhaps I don't know how they went about doing it, but could they have just taken what Solomon wrote, and here Solomon's writing that these are the words of so-and-so, rather than going and finding themselves the words of Agar and the son of Jakeh and whatever, and inserting them in the book of Proverbs in conjunction with the writings of Solomon.
yeah, I suppose that's possible. Yes.
Okay. Not that it's important, it was just a curiosity to me, that's all.
Yeah, I would say that perhaps that is possible.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so let's look at Proverbs 1 through 7. And so it'll probably be wise if you would turn there.
No pun intended, right?
I'm glad you picked that up, Scott. I was wondering if anybody would. All right, I'll just read this passage, and then, and as I'm reading, consider verses 1 through 6, and then the question is going to be, why should we study the book of Proverbs, and what are we supposed to learn? That'll be one of the questions, but so here we go. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So, according to this passage, why do we study Proverbs?
Wisdom.
Okay? To know wisdom.
To learn to fear God.
Okay, to learn to fear God.
Make good decisions in our own lives.
Okay, where do you see that? Perhaps verse 4, to give prudence to the simple, or to receive instruction and wise dealing. Let the wise hear and increase in learning. So yeah, that's good. So what are some of the things we're going to learn according to these first 6 verses? Knowledge. What else?
Instruction.
Instruction.
Wisdom.
Okay, wisdom.
Insight, understanding.
All right, good. Insight and understanding.
Righteousness, justice, equity.
Yeah. So knowledge and discretion. Yeah, so those are some things that we hopefully will learn as we go through this, as Solomon introduces this collection.
I was just hitting on the word wisdom here. And it's not the same word throughout the 7 verses. It changes.
Mm-hmm.
The word wisdom, the original word wisdom, changes in the verses. It's not all the same word.
Right.
They have different meanings. I was trying to find out if they were all consistent, wisdom, or if there is some other meaning, like a divine wisdom or secular wisdom or something like that. And I haven't read what they are, but they do change.
So let me see here. I'm seeing the typical Hebrew word for wisdom is chachma, and I'm seeing verse 2 is chachma. Wise in verse 3 is shakal, which would be somebody who is wise. That would be a synonym. The wise in verse 5 is hakam, which would just be a different form of chachma. And the words of the wise in verse 6, again, hakam, again, a derivative of chachma.
It's interesting to me that the
Change.
meanings, the changing of the meanings invokes some kind of a deeper meaning than just one word can handle.
Well, a couple of things. Number one, we have one change that I see, and that's in verse 3. Otherwise, they're all the same. So in verse 3, when we get there,
Insight, success.
So let's see here. Brown Driver Briggs puts that as being prudent, attentive. Let's see what that is. That is a fill verb, so that means that's going to be kind of an imperative, and has the idea of prospering. And so, yeah, I don't see any huge, I wouldn't make, from an interpretive standpoint, I don't know that I would make a huge distinction in those, but I think it's good to note that.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, sorry.
oh, that's good. Good. No, I'm glad we want to look at those things. So, in our chapter, who is being addressed in this?
Looks like verse 8 gives that away.
All right, maybe, yeah, we got kind of moved away a little bit from verses 1 through 7, but yeah, my sons, let me ask you this. Look at verse 7. What are the two responses to Proverbs?
To love wisdom or just to hate it.
I'm sorry?
To either love or hate wisdom.
All right, yeah, I think that, yeah, so one, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom. All right? One, I think one person is going to see that this is, the fear of the Lord is how I begin my path of wisdom. The other despises wisdom. And if they despise wisdom, what are they going to despise? Yeah, they're going to despise fearing the Lord. So, man, got no need for that.
And I also wonder whether when they say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, possibly what they're getting at is without the fear of the Lord, the rest of this stuff isn't going to do you a whole lot of good.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, because again, you might be smart, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but that doesn't make you wise. And it's interesting because in 1 Corinthians 1:18, we read Paul says, "For the word of the cross is foolishness or folly to those who are perishing." And so, I don't know, foolishness, the cross is folly or foolishness to those. So the fool is the one who doesn't fear God. Let me ask you, we talked about how Solomon gained wisdom. So how do we gain wisdom? I have somebody turn to James 1, verses 5 through 8, and then somebody else, James 3 through 18, or 13 through 18. James 1, 5 through 8, and then another reading, James 3, 13 through 18.
I've got James 3.
All right, Kent has James 3. Who has James 1, 5 through 8?
I'll do James 1, 5 through 8.
Thank you. Let's hear it.
Oh, may I go ahead?
We're ready.
If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea and is driven and tossed by the wind. For the person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways.
Okay, Kelsey, what would you say? How does a person get wisdom according to that passage?
To ask for it in faith.
Yeah, to ask God in faith. So, faith.
That's the important.
Yeah, not doubting. Let them ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach. But let them ask with faith, without doubting. All right. So that's pretty awesome. How about Kent, James 3, 13 through 18?
Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds and the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. The wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and self-ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace.
Right. Any idea how we get wisdom, how wisdom is granted to us from, does that verse help us? Does that passage help us understand how we get wisdom? Begins with, who's wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have, here's the contrast, but if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast. That's not wisdom that comes down from above. Wisdom from above is pure. So, any thoughts on where wisdom comes from?
God.
Yeah, it comes from above.
From above.
What were you going to say, Scott?
Well, you said from above, and so I guess I would then by parallel say that the Bible is written by God, so
Yeah.
I would assume you would get godly wisdom from the Bible.
Yeah. Well, let me my last question before our conclusion is something Jesus said was pretty interesting. In Luke chapter 11:31 and in Matthew 12:42, he said this, indeed, one greater than Solomon is here. What does that statement imply about Jesus' relationship to the wisdom of the Old Testament? Solomon being the wisest man, and Jesus is saying someone greater than Solomon is here.
God.
Okay? So my question then is, what does this statement imply about Jesus' relationship to wisdom in the Old Testament?
His wisdom is greater than Solomon.
Okay?
What'd you say?
That his wisdom is greater than Solomon.
So it's here, let me just read the whole text. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here.
Well, the implication, I think, is that Solomon received his wisdom somewhere from some, in some, I mean, he was the most wise man, and it had to come from somewhere.
Okay?
And this someone would have been Jesus, who was greater than Solomon.
Okay? Yeah?
Didn't Solomon ask wasn't Solomon asked what he wanted and he said wisdom? And because he said wisdom, he got all kinds of other goodies?
Yep. That's true. So I think when we talk about Jesus' relationship to the wisdom of the Old Testament, it's almost as though, man, all of the wisdom of the Old Testament, something's greater than even all of Solomon's wisdom. Something greater is here. The very wisdom of God is personified in your midst. And all of Solomon's wisdom, as great as it is, I'm greater. I am the very wisdom of God in your midst. So anyways, I just thought that was an interesting statement, how Jesus speaks of that. Any other thoughts? All right, I'm going to wrap it up. So just in conclusion, the book of Proverbs then is concerned to give us practical guidelines for daily experience. Oftentimes it's the neglected treasure of the Old Testament, but there are untold riches for us. And so it holds real concrete advice. It comes from the mind of God himself. If we want wisdom, this is the fountain from which we are to drink. And so we need to listen to the wisdom of God so that we can cut through the distractions of this life. And we need to be zealous to learn how to handle this book properly. So with that, there are no other questions or comments. I'm going to call it a night. Going once, going twice, going 3 times. Thanks everyone for showing up. Thanks
Good night.
Cheers, everybody.
Be blessed. Have a great day.
wasn't paying attention and I looked up, I could see out that window and, uh-oh.
It's not too dark. There's still
Well,
some light.
that's why I wanted to get going, so.
Yeah.